The United States and Ukraine have signed a long-awaited deal. Let's come back to the story that we had at the top of the news. It gives the U.S. access to Ukraine's critical minerals and natural resources.
Today's agreement signals clearly to Russian leadership that the Trump administration is committed to a peace process centered on a free, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine over the long term.
These are new images into us this morning of the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent there on the left and the Ukrainian First Deputy Prime Minister as they signed the deal in Washington yesterday. It took months of contentious negotiations to get to that point. The fund is called the U.S. Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund. It allows the U.S. to invest in Ukraine's resources and reconstruction and share in profits from future sales of critical mineral and energy reserves. The assessment is it's a big step forward for Kyiv in ensuring future Ukrainian security and in mending what have been, at times, fractious relations between U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and their two administrations. Let's see if that's what our next guest thinks of things. Bohdan Nahaylo is the editor for the Kyiv Post. He's a journalist whose perspective we have turned to often during Russia's war on Ukraine. Welcome back to the program, Bohdan. Good to see you again.
My great pleasure, Heather, to be on your show again.
Your First Deputy Prime Minister and indeed the Prime Minister of Ukraine characterized this as a fair and equal deal. What do you think of it?
It's certainly very different from what America was proposing, or rather the Trump administration was proposing weeks ago. Then it sounded more like a kind of 19th century colonialist ultimatum. It was all about the U.S. The Ukrainians were put in a very difficult position. They were basically told to get on their knees and beg America to come in and take what they wanted. But what we have now is far more satisfactory. Look, there's no mention of Ukraine's so-called debt obligation, because of what the Biden administration had given Ukraine. Trump had been insisting that Ukraine pay back for all the help that it has received. The ownership of the minerals remains with Ukraine. This is a long-term process. We're not expecting dividends and cash to be appearing for at least 10 years from this. Plus, also, it has to be ratified, this agreement, by the Ukrainian parliament. The government takes it back now, and the executive submits it in the next 2 weeks to the Ukrainian parliament. But what we have now is far better than what was presented to Ukraine merely weeks ago.
And what do you think is responsible for the U.S. moving away from that original position and making it more favorable to Ukraine's terms?
A combination of factors. Zelensky's firmness, that he didn't give way, even though he was under immense pressure. And the fact that other countries, Canada, for example, didn't give way when faced with the very unreasonable tariffs that were being imposed on them and many other countries. The fact that Europe has backed Ukraine and not walked away from Ukraine as the Americans were threatening to do. And I think the fact that within the US itself, the Trump administration, Trump, after his first 100 days, his ratings are falling. And I think they realize in the White House that it wasn't all going to be diktat the way that Trump had imagined it to be, that the world is far more complex and that countries will stand up for their rights.
You mentioned one positive is this does not act as payment for past services, it doesn't cover any debt for past U.S. aid, but there is still a question about the future. And I'm wondering, President Zelensky had posted back in March that he hoped this would be a step toward greater security and solid security guarantees. Those were his words back in March. This reportedly does not include explicit guarantees of future U.S. security assistance. How big a void is that, or how consequential if that is missing?
It is very important, and it's also significant that it's still missing this element of security. But implicitly, it's there because it commits the US and US business to be involved in Ukraine for the longer term, because, as I said, it's going to take years before any dividends appear. What is missing, of course, is that even in the statement that your viewers just heard, that the US says it's going to remain committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and democracy, there's no mention of territorial integrity. What is the price that Ukraine is supposed to be paying in order to placate Vladimir Putin? This is something that Trump wants to do, to get Putin to back off and take a chunk of Ukraine and Crimea, and then, call it quits at Ukraine's expense. So we don't have the details. We don't have the full details yet of the actual agreement, which is now in the present shape it's in is positive, but we don't know what the context is, what the broader context is, and how the White House will behave in the next days, literally, as we await the celebrations in Moscow of their VE Day.
And the supposed ceasefire to coincide with that. I'm wondering what you think in terms of the impact this agreement could have on the war effort on the ground and on the ongoing efforts to secure peace.
Look, it's obvious that Moscow will not be happy with this agreement. It's not what they wanted. They don't want the Americans to have even a toehold in Ukraine. By the way, this agreement also stipulates that this does not prejudice Ukraine's ambitions to join the EU. Clearly, there's no mention of NATO because Trump has made it clear that he's against Ukraine joining NATO. But in a significant concession, there's also no opposition from the US side to the Ukrainians trying to join the EU, which is also very important and will irk Moscow as well. The reaction we've seen overnight, there was a very heavy, deadly attack on Odessa this time. Odessa, a grain port, very vital to Ukraine's economy. So you've got an answer there and then. And all along the front line, the fighting has intensified in recent days, with the Russians feeling that they should try and grab as much more land as they can in case they're forced to have a ceasefire and a frozen conflict along the line of contact as it exists today.
Okay. Finally, today I'm interested. We've been watching Ukrainian President Zelensky on the world stage. I was in Rome for the Pope's funeral, for example, and the reaction from those assembled, the applause when they saw him on the big screen. So we're seeing him there. We're focusing on this deal. And here in Canada, we're also hearing of a phone call yesterday between our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and President Zelensky. Prime Minister Carney has invited President Zelensky to Kananaskis next month for the G7 meeting. What do you see as the relationship now and in the future between Canada and Ukraine?
I think it will be much stronger. There is great empathy and sympathy for Canada, faced with a neighbor that it has become a difficult neighbor under Trump. And I think there's a great deal of support for Canada and respect for the leadership that Carney has shown and which has won him the election also in Canada, essentially, because people expected him to lose. So in Ukraine, I mean, but probably in Canada too. So I think there's a great deal of mutual respect amongst the leaders, but also respect for Canada for having stood firm. And perhaps, I think deep down, it's Canada's example that also, shall we say, encouraged Zelensky to stand firm and not to give way to Trump.
Bohdan, I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you for your perspective this morning, as always. Bohdan Nahaylo, the chief editor for the Kyiv Post. Thanks again.
Thank you.